I'm Emily. I started my career, I guess, yeah, in Cairo. I graduated from NYU, and at NYU, I was studying Middle Eastern and Islamic studies, and I was always interested in the Middle East, especially the Arabic language. I just find it really beautiful. I grew up learning Hebrew, so I felt that Arabic was a really complementary language to have. And I studied abroad when I was at NYU for my semester at AUC, the American University of Cairo, and I just didn't get enough. It was only 6 months. Egypt is an insanely incredible country. It's so vibrant, it's complicated. And so after I graduated, I was like, I've got to go back. I've got to improve my Arabic, because that was really the driving focus for me. And we had the chance to meet we were at the same language school. And unfortunately had to leave Egypt in 2011 during the revolution in January, and came to Israel the first time in 2011, where I spent 2.5 years working at the.
But that was like your first time setting foot on Israeli soil. Like you had never been there before.
No, actually it wasn't. So I grew up coming to Israel quite frequently because I'm Jewish and I have a lot of family here. But it was my first time living here. I mean, I was always, I was coming as a kid and definitely learning the language at school. I went to a Jewish day school, but I wasn't planning on moving here in 2011. Let's put it that way. So life has its way of just being unpredictable, as we all know, in 2020. And that was certainly the case in 2011 for me as well. And I'm sure for anyone else that lived through the revolution. But Israel was an incredible landing pad for me. And it gave me really my first taste of the high tech scene here.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So that's the thing, growing up, because if we start tracing back, the first times that you actually visited the country, things like that, maybe some of these things are difficult to perceive as well when you're younger about, when was the first time you heard the word startup or things like that. But just for people to understand in terms of context, as someone who's been going to Israel for a long period of time, who's now living there, what is it that you think makes this place unique? Because we can talk a little bit later about, the Basque country, what makes the Basque country unique, and there are many different things there. And also I want to invite everyone who's here, you can feel free to comment anything in the chat at any point in time. If you have questions, we'd be happy to answer them. It's kind of the idea behind this. But yeah, anyway, so how do you see, what makes Israel tick? What makes it different?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I have to say that my background first, it was not in startups or technology. I came from a policy background. After I lived in Israel, the first time I went to Washington, D.C., where I was a political fundraiser. And I personally had never used the word ecosystem, if I wasn't in a science class, right? I didn't even have the lingo. But what I knew was that something, of course, really interesting was happening in Israel over the course of many, many decades. But I think when my first time in Israel, I was like, this is a place that like innovation is thriving. And what's the reason for that? And there's multiple reasons. I think from my perspective, something that I like to remind people that haven't been here is that Israel's a really young country. It's 72 years old, right? We're not, if you compare it to the US, they've got hundreds of years on it.
And can I just admit, like, a really silly thing as well too is that out of my own ignorance when I was younger, because of reading the Bible and things like that, you imagine like, oh, this is a country that's 5,000 years old. Okay, we can talk about what's the difference between a country, what's the difference between a nation. There are lots of different tricky things that we definitely don't have enough time to talk about today. But I think it's a super good point. But very, very young country, very young country.
Very young. I mean, it was the state of Israel was founded in 1948. So we're talking about like a generation and a half before us, right? That were really, and there's a phrase in Hebrew called chalutzim, and that means pioneers. So the people that came to Israel in the mandate period, but also were here during the state of Israel, came to a country that was literally, and I'm not exaggerating, there are photos of this online, sand dunes. I mean, Tel Aviv, the city that I'm in right now, this vibrant city, both from the tech perspective, real estate, food, it's compared to New York and the Mediterranean, was literally sand dunes 72 years ago. So I like to just think, and I think some Israelis would agree with me, that there is just this innovation and entrepreneurial spirit in the DNA of Israelis, because you had to be. And let's not forget, the region of this world only recently has become a little friendlier with some new normalizations and ties. But at the time in 1948, Israel really was surrounded by not so friendly countries to it. So the mentality of the Israeli people has really been to build because there was no other option. So that's really intrinsic in the way that Israelis think and I think approach problems. If we want to just take another perspective, Israel, there's obligatory mandatory military conscription. So at age 18, men and female, if you're Jewish, get conscripted to the army. And it's in these vital formative years, 18 to 20 if you're a woman, 18 to 21 if you're a man, that many Israelis are serving in these super elite military units. One that's really famous, that maybe it's known as the 8200, in Hebrew it's called Shmona Matayim, and it's the premier military unit. It's massive. And coming out of this, well, when in the unit, these young soldiers are forced to use really advanced technologies, a lot of time AI-based technologies, to protect the state of Israel. And they're also forced to work really closely under stressful circumstances with other soldiers. And that environment has created almost this, a place where founders have met each other, because they know they can work well under pressure. And I think anyone who has a startup or has worked in tech knows that one of the most important relationships is the founder and co-founder. It's basically a marriage. And so in these army units, you have a proven experience for 3+ years, and plus if you continue on as a officer and a higher rank, to work under these really incredible, tough circumstances with cutting edge technology. Many of this technology has now been applied to other industries. So the basis of a lot of Israeli technology came from the military units, and that's really unique and a huge part of the ecosystem.
Good. We got quite a few things here. I think there's a lot of things that we can look at. As you mentioned, going through this intense experience at the age of 18, both gives you access to technology, gives you access to, I would say, structure and discipline in terms of understanding order, chain of command, many different things. We're talking about ecosystems. If we think about all the different elements that go into a military context. And then is also on top of that, the sort of bonding and getting to understand how other people operate, getting used to work with people from all different kinds of backgrounds, all different kinds of educational interests, things of that nature. And so it's almost at a point, it's like, well, if we went through a bunch of dangerous situations with technology when we were 18, how difficult could the startup world really be? All right.
Absolutely. Like they actually have battle wounds, in like the realest sense of the word.
Yeah. And it's true, because we often talk about technologies as being battle tested, and this couldn't be a more true example of that happening.
Absolutely. And I think so much, everything you said is absolutely right. And I think the resilience that you get in these difficult situations, I mean, being a founder, being an early stage founder, and then taking a company, if you can get it off the ground, to a growth stage, you need to have a lot of resilience. It is not an easy journey. And we can talk a little bit about this when we talk about MassChallenge and the early stage founders we're supporting. But it is often a lonely job. If you haven't found your co-founder yet, there's huge decisions that you have to make at these critical stages, and a lot of startups don't make it. So having that resilience, and also there's something that is a word that we use here that maybe you're familiar with. It's chutzpah. It's a word, right? It's like audacity, and it's in a positive sense though. And Israelis have that chutzpah. They're not going to take no for an answer, and it's ingrained in the DNA of this country. Again, so much from the history of just the state of Israel, but also, it's just the culture of the place, really. So not taking no for an answer, being resilient and being direct, and like asking for what you want, and just moving forward. It's something for me, being from Washington, D.C., which is like the most diplomatic place in the world. It's a very different type of interaction and conversation that you have.
I think it's a really good point. I think there are a couple things here too, is that, yeah, sometimes what do you prefer? Someone telling you that something's good when in reality they don't mean it, or just being very straight up and very direct. And particularly in the startup world, I think you can't afford to spend so much time, beating around the bush and not being direct and honest. Say, if it's not working, it's not working. We got to change this right now and start and change. So I think also with the military background, I think in terms of taking decisions, that probably helps a lot too. Understanding that there are going to be calculated risks and probably some losses and difficult. It's not all going to be, a rosy sort of path. Another thing I think is just to touch a little bit on the Basque Country side is that because of the natural terrain and topography of the Basque Country, it's really a difficult place to live in. It's not desert; it's the opposite. It's mountainous, but with very, very harsh winds, very rainy, things like that. So people that have lived here, historically speaking, if they were going to make it, it meant having to work really, really hard. Understanding you're going to have to make sacrifices. There are going to be really tough circumstances, guaranteed, not something you can just conveniently sort of duck or dodge away from. And so I think there is something about Basque people's character of a naturally resilient people. And also I could further say as well too, there is a strong collaborative spirit of working together because of understanding that, like, well, if you're in difficult circumstances, and I probably am too, I think it's still different than in the case of Israel of having arrived at a place and having built it from the ground up in their own way and with their own things in mind. And once again, braving the elements. And these are some things we can talk about a little bit later. But for example, I'm from California, and California is well known for water technologies because of water shortages and having a large population. It's no secret that Israel is neck and neck and probably better in some areas than in others in California. But I think a lot of that comes from, how do you create agriculture in a desert? With a lot of creativity and a lot of determination. I think also as well, though, too, it's interesting just to talk about, once again, the sort of fusion between public and private spheres, which we'll definitely talk about more later, is that a lot of times when I explain, because I am from Northern California, that how the Silicon Valley, not the only reason why it got started, but the combination of good universities and a very high demand for naval and Air Force technologies. Is it a secret that where Google is located is very close to an Air Force base? And having naval bases that are in the area, what did ships need? Good communication, radar, radios, all that kind of stuff. And so that was sort of the part of the initial driving force that brought the Silicon Valley into being. And in its own way, I think Israel's kind of gone through that process as well. Yeah. Obviously, another thing is, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say something that you said really resonated about to the community in the Basque Country, and sort of it sounds like it's a close knit and community, and that's something that in Israel too. It's just a very small country. There's about 8 million citizens that live in the country. It's the size of New Jersey approximately. So you can get from north to south in one day if you're driving quickly. Like, I don't know how they drive in Spain, but in Israel they drive pretty quickly. 6.5 hours, right? It's 7 hours. It's not big. And so this sense of everyone is sort of in this country together. If I need to call someone up and get a connection to this person, or I want a meeting, it's almost a 2 degree of separation in this country because it is so small. And so I think the culture of paying it forward and helping someone out and taking that coffee meeting is one that's really embraced here. And I've been on the receiving end of that as a non-Israeli. I'm living in Israel now for 2.5 years. To get a meeting in Washington, a networking meeting, you had to go through a chain of command, right? Like, it was not an obvious process, or it was a process, but it wasn't obvious when you get to the end. Here in Israel, you make one phone call, someone typically introduces you. So I think that sense of support and community, we all kind of we're all trying to figure this out, this innovation stuff, and together we're a lot more we're stronger, and we can do a lot more. I think that's something that does permeate in the culture.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And also is that, know your strengths and play to them. Talking about population of Israel, we're talking about around 8 million people in the Basque Country. And it gets complicated to decide exactly what the Basque Country is and what it isn't and who is here and who isn't. I have the luxury of being a foreigner, so it's easy for me to say. Approximately 2.3 million people. And in terms of driving, much less than 6.5 hours, right? But it's true. But even then, but I think that that's one of the convenient things is that the 3 main capitals in what's called the Basque Autonomous Community in a legal sense are all basically 1 hour apart from each other. So you can move around quite quickly. And then, like you said as well, if there are basically 3 major universities and there are other technology centers and things like that. But if you didn't go to one, you probably went to another. And so that sort of close knit, sometimes it can border on endogamy, and then you have to be a little bit careful about where to break out and how to bring in different ideas, because if everybody thinks exactly the same, that can be positive, but you also need to diversify. And I think that's one of the things that Israel, by having such good connections as well too with other countries, the United States not being an exception, but plenty of other places as well, I think that's what brings in fresh ideas.
For sure. I think also the diversity of ideas is a really important point. I think I think Israeli founders know that, there's an extent at which you can stay so insular, right? Like and that's another thing, is that Israeli companies, because the market is never going to be Israel, it's such a small country, there's no market size here. They're global from day one. So some of those are obviously bolstered by the bilateral relationships that Israel has with the US and European countries and African countries. And so you see direct links to the innovation there. But absolutely, I mean, you're seeing companies in Israel growing. They're growth companies from almost, the first or second year. They have to open offices. They don't have to, but they typically do. And sometimes the investors, if they're getting investment from the US, would like to see that in the US, primarily in New York and Silicon Valley. And so they're bringing in, and then of course, European countries and other countries. So they're bringing in different ways of thinking. And ultimately, I think that is what, that globality is what sometimes sets Israeli companies apart from day one.
This is a super good point. And like you said, that from the very get-go, in terms of scalability and thinking about expansion, that like, no. The last thing I want to do is only sell in my local market. I've got to be thinking much, much bigger than that. And I think that sometimes that can be a bit of a pitfall. It's normal that people know their local markets better, but you really got to be a student of the world to understand global trends that are going on, because maybe you have a great idea, but it's in terms of, not just profitability, but in terms of market reach, how far are you actually going to get? I think that's a very, very powerful takeaway for all of us, is to, what are the things that we can be doing to be thinking globally? Probably reading global news, interacting with people from other countries, putting out feelers constantly, knowing multiple languages. There are tons and tons of different things that can relate there. Now, let's jump in a little bit more to MassChallenge. How did you get to MassChallenge, or how did MassChallenge get to you?
That's a great question. How did they get to me? Yeah. I actually got to them. So when I moved, so I mentioned at the beginning, this is my second time living in Israel. I did a 2.5-year stint at the British Embassy. I took a 5-year hiatus working in politics in DC. And then I came back in 2018. And I knew that when I came back to Israel, I wanted to work in tech. But in typical like Emily fashion, the way I do things is I buy a one-way plane ticket somewhere and I like figure it out and I just hustle. And I did have a network here from, the years prior. So it wasn't all finding my way blindly, but I knew that I wanted to work in a place that was exporting Israeli technology globally, but also a global organization. Because for me, being, a former policy person, I find it so interesting how Israeli technology can be a bridge to the world and a bridge to countries that they might not have super warm diplomatic relations. Because we all know that Israel around the world, sometimes it's complicated, right? It's complicated. So when I got to Israel the second time around, like everyone, I was networking, and consistently MassChallenge's name came up in meetings because of my background and like the global diplomatic side. And I was really, I met the managing director. I was super attracted to MassChallenge for a number of reasons. And one is that it's a nonprofit organization. Some of you guys on the call might be familiar with MassChallenge. I know there's a program that we do in the Basque with our bridge program. But what I mean by that is we do all of our innovation programming, and we'll get into that in a second. We take zero equity from our startup. So what we do,
nothing.
Literally, no, we take nothing. There is no cost for any startup to participate. Our model as an accelerator is to reduce all barriers of entry to the ecosystem. And for me, someone who also came from development work in Egypt, my first job was at an NGO called Ashoka. I'm really interested in doing everything you can to provide the conditions for people to succeed. One of the other things that really attracted me to MassChallenge, it's not something we talk about so much, but to be sort of blunt, in Israel, there's a certain type of person that like makes it far, right? It's typically men that serve in the same units together. And so it's much harder for sometimes women or ultra-Orthodox or Arab Israelis who do not go to the army, or Palestinians that are living in our neighboring country. And MassChallenge has innovation programming to basically level the playing field and provide access to folks that don't always have the same opportunities as individuals that serve in these elite units. So to me, again, with my development policy background, I thought that was really interesting. And then just on top of that, the globality of what we do. I mean, we are an Israeli-based accelerator, but every year we have about 50 startups in our cohort. We accelerate once a year. over the last 5 years, we've had startups from 18 different countries.
Oh, wow.
One of those startups actually came from the Basque region. I think her Vostok was the startup's name, working in electricity and clean energy when it comes to motorcycles. But also from Rwanda, from Nigeria, from Poland, of course, the US, the UK, from India, really all 18 different countries. And I think that is a really powerful tool for Israel, and a diplomatic tool, really. So when I heard the stories and of the founders that have been able to succeed and grow their businesses with our model, I was hooked.
Yeah, I think there. Well, anyway, there's two things that I want to take out of that. Because from talking to a lot of startups that go into these programs, a lot of times they say that, the program often offers certain benefits, but a lot of times it's a context that you make with other startups that might be in those programs that will often stay for life. And that you create a context where you have the Israeli context, which creates a very unique set of circumstances that are obviously going to have a direct influence on these startups, as well as getting to know each other in that environment. It's kind of like we go back to the military thing. It's like we all go through this intense experience together, and the learnings that we get out of it and the connections that you make will stay with you for life. That was one thing. Another thing that I want to touch on more on a Basque level, all right, because if we're just talking about, we're talking about Israelis being direct, Basque people are not famous they're not famous for being indirect. They are famous for being relatively direct, if they don't like something or things like that. But one thing that we find a lot in our community regarding startups is people saying that we need more networking opportunities, or that people don't know how to network. Obviously, both professionally, but personally, you are a very good networker. What is your strategy when it comes to that?
Wow, that's a really good question. What is my strategy when it comes to, I think it's a couple of things, but I think maintaining your relationships, right? I think that can be sometimes a challenge, right? It's like, and I've seen Israelis do this the wrong way, right? You don't want to feel like a relationship is purely transactional, right? Like if I'm networking in a country and I'm having a meeting, I know that I want something out of this meeting and I want to get introduced to XYZ. But I think what I've learned is, like, to make these relationships meaningful, you need to just have touch points, right? Apart from that, you need to build on them. You need to maintain them, keep folks appraised of what you're doing. Listen, there's lots of tools you can use to do this. LinkedIn is a great one. I'm not probably telling anyone anything they don't know, but I think it's, for what I do as a director of partnerships, for me, it's the power of relationships and stewarding those relationships. So, it's not that you have to touch base once a month or once a week, but when you have updates to share, I find in life that, and this has happened, look, our story is a perfect example of this. Everyone comes back, right? Bart and I met a decade ago, and we hadn't spoken really. As I said, keep your relationship. But we've like, on LinkedIn, we would like, hey, how are you doing? We had a little bit, we did have an interaction. And like, that is like a warm enough, and then we're able to do this kind of talk. And I do find that people come back in your life. So, not burning bridges, keeping people in the loop, and being just really straightforward and professional with people. And I think that there is sometimes I don't want to, bash Israelis, but there is sometimes there's this, Israelis will go to invest, especially when you're doing investment, right? When you're trying to raise a round. I've never raised a round myself, but I've heard many horror stories from all the startups I worked with. It is a relationship. Just because they tell you no, which I hope they will be clear and tell you no, that doesn't mean that you can't check in when you have a new product launch, or when something has happened in your company, because they might come around for your Series B round, your Series C round. It's really, really good to just like stay in touch with folks. And it's hard. Listen, we're old. Like, we've been around for a while at this point. There's a lot of people to keep in touch. So I would say, to the extent that we can use technology to support that, that's how I've sort of done my best to maintain relationships.
I think that's a very, very good point. And because sometimes as well too, is that sometimes people feel maybe reluctant to reach out and meet new people, because then it's like, how many friends can I have, or how many contacts can I have? How can I reasonably take care of or attend all these different contacts? But I think there's a lot to be said for, as you said, being upfront, because sometimes it's happened to me in my experience of like trying to meet people, and maybe all you're doing is you just want to have a conversation. That's it. But they assume that there's some kind of a sale or some kind of a hook that's going to be involved in this. But over time, I would say that I try to make it very, very clear from the very beginning, this is exactly what I'm talking about. There's no ulterior motives here.
Absolutely. I could not agree. It's like, when I came to Israel the second time, I was like, I would love to talk to you about something and, get your opinion. I think people love being asked for their opinion and they love to be asked about what they think about things. That is a great tip that I have found. Like I want to know how smart people are thinking about something. So tell me what you think. People love to talk about themselves and just, how they view the world. So just, sort of shifting. It's not all about you. It's not all about me. It's about us. And help me get to the next place. For me, as I said, I had a very specific interest in mind. I knew I wanted to be in a global organization. There are many, but who are the leaders? Who are the best? And it sort of takes some time talking to folks and mapping the ecosystem and mapping that network. But I think being upfront and also paying it forward. I have to say, like I always say yes. If someone wants to connect me with someone they know for an informational networking call, I always say yes to that because so many people have said yes to me. So I think just paying it forward and being, not to say that your whole day needs to be helping other people. You need to be focused and carve out time for yourself, but just to help people out. I think that's really good karma, good energy, and it goes a long way.
That's a really good point. And that, yeah, you just have to believe that, okay, maybe I'll blindly put myself out there and maybe you end up doing more favors than you should. But overall, like you said, it balances out.
You never know who you're going to meet. That's the crazy thing, especially in Israel. I mean, again, I have not been. I hope one day to get to.
You will be in the best country. Yeah.
But it's just, because it's coming back to what we said earlier, it's such a small country that everyone's connected. It's very likely that you're going to have someone in common and they're going to have someone on their mind right away that wants to help you, whether it's for your own professional goals or for a VC raise. And the best way to do anything in life, as we know, is through a warm connection.
Yeah.
And so, you never know what something could lead to. So it's kind of exciting. I always like to say networking, fundraising, it's like dating, right? Like it's just, you never know. You have to go on a couple dates to figure it out. I know it's been a while for you, Bart, since you were out on
Yeah. I wouldn't know where to start. I'm very, very rusty, but I think it's a good point. Good. Now, taking this a little bit further, we found out about how you got to MassChallenge, and so can you tell us what does what does your day-to-day life? I mean, I imagine there's probably a lot of variety, but what does someone in your position do every day?
Okay, yeah. Well, 2020 has shaken things up. So I live in Tel Aviv, but our office at MassChallenge is actually in Jerusalem, in the capital, which is not traditionally referred to as the tech hub in Israel. I think Tel Aviv in the center of the country is much more known. We were strategically, we opened in 2016 because we think Jerusalem has an incredible amount of potential, and the startups that we support drive economic growth. And so great jobs, and they are driving their forces in the economy. They're catalyzing the economy. So we're in Jerusalem for a specific reason. But my day-to-day as director of partnerships, so as I mentioned earlier, we're a nonprofit organization and we're supported by a network of partners. And those look like government funders, corporates, service providers, foundations, and individuals. So on the one hand, my job is to ensure that those bodies are engaging with the accelerator and the startups, most importantly, and we're creating value. And so what value looks like for a corporate is very different from what value looks like for an individual. So we really, I work with my team to tailor their experience and build out offerings that are valuable. And many of the corporations, of course, are looking for various tech solutions to solve their pain points. So everyone has the different needs. And then the other side of my job is really is business development. So I'm looking for new opportunities for MassChallenge because as the market shifts, we're shifting our offering. So I think what we're known for right now more traditionally is our core accelerator program that runs once a year it's about 3.5 months from end of April to end of July. And I would love to get into that in a moment. But there's other innovation and open innovation programs that I'm initiating and working with governments like government of Taiwan, the US government, to create valuable programming to connect with Israeli technology. So
I want to take that a little bit further because is that you intentionally create relationships outside of your country so that it comes back to your country.
Yes, I'm intentionally doing that. And some of these relationships have come through MassChallenge headquarters in Boston. Some have been folks that I've been in touch with, and I'm through my networking. But I'm relationship building all the time to find new opportunities and looking at strategically, like where MassChallenge is going to be in 5 years. We're going to be much more. We already are much more than an accelerator, but what are we going to be doing? What's going to be our core work? And we're certainly seeing and hearing in my conversations that I'm having day to day that, things are shifting. Companies now want specific startups that are going to be addressing their pain points or their challenges, right? So, for some companies, they want us to run or power a startup competition. We've done that for a number of corporates that are not partnering with our core accelerator program. So really keeping, it's a very creative job, which is like one of the things I love about it. I think if it was just a purely sales job, it would be a little challenging, but the biz dev, developing relationships, and really looking for ways to bring international opportunities to Israel, and hopefully that goes vice versa. It goes two ways. Yeah.
And then now with this in mind, so there are a lot of accelerators out there. There are a lot of programs out there. We're in touch with many of them, locally speaking, internationally speaking. What would you say are characteristics that make the startups unique that would be in MassChallenge in general and more broadly, but then more specifically in Israel?
Yeah, it's a great question. There are a lot of accelerators and incubators and corporate accelerators in Israel, and it's a really saturated market. And there's some incredible accelerators here. I think MassChallenge is one of those, and there's a number. And we all do a little bit. We do things a little bit differently. But what makes us unique in my mind, like I mentioned, we are a nonprofit. So again, startups, we take zero equity. That is almost unheard of when it comes to the.
I was just gonna say, like off the top of my mind, I don't really know.
There's another one in Israel, but it's actually the 8200, the Shmona Matayim unit, their accelerator, but it's not a global accelerator. So that's the other thing. We're global in the sense that we are one of 9 MassChallenge programs around the world that have physical offices. There's many more bridge programs, one of those being in the Basque region. I think at least 20 more. But we are global. So what that means is that if you are coming to our program, you are going to be able to connect with experts and mentors and corporates and ventures, VCs from all of those different offices. It multiplies the effect, right? It's like a multiplier effect of impact about the people that you can meet. So you're coming to Israel, but you're really connecting to the world. We operate at scale. So we are the largest accelerator program in the world. But what that means for Israel is that every year we accelerate about 50 companies, which is really huge. I mean, most accelerators in Israel, like we're talking 10 to 15 startups. So, it's a big undertaking. We do this for a number of reasons. One is to expedite the economic growth and we have capacity to work at scale. It's pretty amazing to see that in a 1 year's cohort, like these companies are still around today. They're raising money. 89% of our companies are still kicking, which is pretty cool. And the other thing that makes us unique is that we're sector agnostic. So we're not focusing on one sector. Startups that come to the MassChallenge Israel program or any other program are working to solve challenges in every industry. And that's really cool. So you're seeing startups in food tech, in clean energy, in cyber, of course, in education technology. So it's really, really diverse. And the reason we do this is because we see that there's a lot of benefits that come from like the interdisciplinary approach of working together, because I think there's a lot of value, of course, for accelerators that are fintech oriented or health tech oriented. I think those are great. But what we're seeing is that it does really help to exchange problems from industry to industry, because you don't want to be so siloed and think in a vacuum. And sometimes people that, like we talked about the diversity of opinions before, that have an approach to doing something in ag tech might actually work for the health tech. And so it really just creates, again, the multiplier effect of your community and your network. And we're a competition at the end of the day. So startups that come into our program have a chance to win equity-free, no strings attached cash, and win when it's not Corona days, win a free trip to the US. You're eligible to win at least usually 10 startups a trip to the US. And we bring the market to you. So we take startups to the US to meet with potential partners, customers, investors. We usually go to Boston and New York. We're headquartered in Boston, of course. And there's no other accelerator program in Israel that operates quite like that. And for anyone on the call that is an early stage founder, and I mean, this is the plug, right? Yeah. Our applications are open right now for 2021, and it's completely free to apply. There's no harm in applying. If anything, I always tell folks that it's great to apply because at every round of judging, there's 2 rounds, you get feedback from our judges. So It's always good to like hear what other folks are, take everything with a little bit of a grain of salt. You don't want to get overwhelmed with everyone's opinion, but you're always going to get constructive feedback when you apply. So we're open for business, and now our programs are completely virtual because of the pandemic. So you can connect to Israel from the comfort of your home.
With that in mind, you said 50 startups get accelerated, all right? That's a lot of startups. Who is, well, a couple of things. How does that process work? Where do they begin? What kind of attention do they receive? How much is it hands-on? How much is hands-off? You mentioned that now everything's being done virtually, but in the past, was it a hybrid option of doing physically coming to Israel, but then doing other things online? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it is a lot. It's a lot of startups. We know that. We've done it now for a decade in the US, and actually the US programs have more than 50. I think they're accelerating 70 plus. So in Israel, we're on the smaller side, which is also just crazy to think about. So the startups that apply to the program, we actually get usually 400 to 500 startups per year that apply. So there's a 10% acceptance rate. So it is quite competitive to get into the program. There's, an application form. We are looking for high impact and high potential startups, right? Startups that founders that are actually spending their day-to-day, full-time working on their startup, that have business plans. They've raised less than $1 million US, not more than that. And you have less than $2 million in revenue. So that's the kind of stage, early stage we're looking for. There's a first round of judging. That's all done online for the judges. They read the application. The second round, if you're invited to move forward, is a pitch. So you're pitching to about 9 folks this year. It will all be virtual. You're going through your deck. You're explaining who you are. You're telling your story. And then you're hopefully, if you're doing it right, leaving time for questions. And then for those that get accepted, like I said, it's about 50. It's a very intensive program. So before Corona, what we would do was 1 day of a curriculum about 9 a.m. to 6 p.m. in Jerusalem. And so that made a hybrid program challenging because for the startups that were overseas, we did expect them, if they could, and we would try to find stipends to come to Israel, come to Jerusalem for at least a portion of the program. So not every founder is in a place to do that for multiple of reasons. It's hard to leave your company, very challenging for 3.5 months. It's expensive. So we were able to put some of our content online, but at the time, because we were primarily an in-person program, I do think that it was a disadvantage not to be in the country and to be in the room, right? The room where it happens for any of my Hamilton fans, and to network and to build community. I'll get to what we're doing this year in a second, but it's a 3.5-month program. So we take startups, we rely on the experts in our community to lead the content. So the MassChallenge staff, we're not the ones that are giving the lectures or leading the workshops. We are convening the top of the Israeli ecosystem, the senior VPs, the serial entrepreneurs, the investors, the alumni community that are raising to come and to really take you from A to Z on building a scalable startup. So that might start off with understanding product market fit, understanding global markets, understanding how to put together founders agreements, of course, your deck, what needs to be in a deck, what doesn't need to be in a deck, what to expect from an investor meeting, how to use that time wisely, how to build a team culture. What are the things that you need to be thinking about now as a CEO that in 5 years are going to come your way, or in 2 years going to come your way? So thinking about these questions and trying to prepare startups for their market is what we do. And we are a competition, like I mentioned. So we end with another pitch, and the 10 startups win the chance to go to the US, and about 3 to 5, depending on the year, win some cash prizes. And we give about 100, it's not a huge amount of money. It's $135,000 total that we have for cash prizes. So
I wouldn't say no. I mean, that's cool.
Right. As an early stage founder, it can be quite meaningful. We do divide that up between 3 and 5 startups, but you might walk away with $50,000, which at the early stage game, and there's no strings attached. That's money for you to do with what you want. So that's the program. This year, like I mentioned, and actually in 2020, we were also completely virtual. We were a little, I think like the rest of the world, a little like concerned, like what is this going to look like? We actually went virtual. Israel went into lockdown in early March, and we went virtual. We had to, because we physically couldn't leave our houses. And I know that you're also experiencing some sort of a lockdown right now, so it's very familiar. But what we found actually is there's silver linings to everything. So here's what the program looks like now. We do, instead of one day, because we do not expect anyone to sit at their computer from 9 to 6, we split the content into 2 to 3.5 hour chunks. So you had, about half your day with MassChallenge. We doubled the content because we did so many optional content, and everyone came. And that was the crazy thing. We had 50 startups and we had a 90% plus engagement rate. When we do it in Jerusalem, we definitely don't have 90% of our cohort coming every. So I think the fact that we were online at the beginning of the pandemic, people really showed up.
And I also think as well too, people maybe this year more than other years probably realized just exactly how lucky they are or were to be in that program, and understanding that this is a really, really good opportunity at a very, very difficult time to get that know-how, to make those connections, to get that feedback, to better situate yourself, to be more competitive. Because in some ways with these difficult situations, a lot of times innovation will go down, people will be more conservative. Or on the other hand, people might be more or less risk averse, that it's like, no, man, this is the time when I'm going to go forward. So I think that it's interesting to see how it worked out that way.
Yeah. And listen, there still are so many unknowns, but especially in March, when everything seemed to shut down around the world, that's when our program launched April 3rd. So we were really with startups that we were all nervous. I was nervous. No one really knew what was happening, but for a company that is looking to raise money and get more customers, it was really just beyond challenging, beyond the typical challenges that founders have. And I think one of the most amazing things is that MassChallenge does provide this incredible tight-knit community of founders. And when you do it at scale, it's like the support comes from everywhere. And one thing that we do in our program, there's 2 things that I think are great. We break out weekly into small pods. So we take that 50, we put you in a group of about 7 to 8 founders, and we do founders forums. It's like a safe, open space to share what's on your plate right now, what are your challenges, how can we help you? And then we continue doing that when you're an alumni of the program. I think that's a really important thing to note too, that after the 3.5 month program, you're always part of the MassChallenge family. Because actually at that point, when you're growing and raising, we might be able to connect you in a different way to some of the partners, maybe a more meaningful way.
That's the thing is, just to keep this in mind, how many names and numbers do you have in your contact list? I'm just thinking of all the people that you've been in touch with. It's got to be crazy. But that's like what you said, is that because of having such a solid network, I just think it just must be challenging sometimes to put all these things together when you're talking about so many different countries. When we're talking about governments, we're talking about corporates, we're talking about other startups, we're talking about people that are full-time dedicated to innovation and R&D. But I think that's what provides a lot of wealth. One other thing that I want to ask about. All right, so this program, it lasts as long as it does, and then generally, what happens once people leave? Is there a fair amount of Is there a fair amount of people that have been involved that then decide, oh, I would like to come back and volunteer as a mentor or work doing some kind of training? How does that work? How's the post MassChallenge work?
That's so interesting that you ask, because we're only 5 years in Israel. We're 10 years globally. So I think we're still seeing sort of what that future looks like for the MassChallenge alumni in terms of their engagement with the program.
Mm.
I'll tell you this, they are all, so we have an alumni program that meets monthly and folks are very engaged. So we can tell that the content is still really relevant and interesting for alumni, no matter what stage you're at. In terms of mentorship, I think we're still waiting to see how that pans out. What we do see are our alumni really willing to give like kind of their perspective, to come to the accelerator, to talk, to lead a session about how they raised money or how they navigated this challenge. So they might not be mentors in the sense that they meet every week with our companies, because it's a lot of time, and you need a lot of times people just don't have that, founders don't have that time, but they're always willing to give of their time if we ask them. And interestingly, in the US, we are seeing some of our startups committing to becoming donors of the program and sponsoring the program, giving a portion of their raise or just personal amounts of money to MassChallenge, which is really new. And we are so grateful that people want to invest their own money in the program, which shows they really, really believe in what we do in the community. I mean, I'll give you an example where we launched applications yesterday for 2021, and we asked our alumni to publicize and to put on their LinkedIn and social media. And one of our founders from last year, from the 2019 cohort, wrote like a really beautiful personal post. He was like, whenever I need anything, whenever I need a question answered or a connection, the MassChallenge community is there for me. So it just shows that we're there for them, because you never leave the family, and they really are there for us. I'd love to see more founders become more involved in the mentorship, but in the meantime, you're never out of our class.
Yeah, but it's like you said, it's two things. By definition, these are people that are going to be extremely busy, and so obviously they would love to have more time to do a lot of different things. But the other thing, which is interesting, kind of coming full circle now, what we talked about in the beginning regarding networking, is the importance of maintaining relationships in whatever way possible, because you never know. Particularly, once again, we're talking about global solutions. We're talking about people with a global mentality. You don't know when you're going to be in some random country and you're going to run into somebody, or that, and like you said,
you're sitting next to you on a plane, you know. what we like.
Yeah, and then someone could be a founder at one point. They could become a CTO or a CFO or a CMO at another point. So you just never know what kind of necessity.
A lot of the founders we found, at least from the 1990s in Israel, who have exited, successfully, a lot of them go into investment. They go into venture, and they want. I think the good ones, they really want to help and take your company to the next level and open up their Rolodex. And so, you might have worked with them in a company, everyone comes full circle, especially in a country like Israel, where it is so small and connected.
Mm-hmm. Now, talking about a country that's so small, a couple of things that we did talk about earlier about, the character of Israeli people being quite direct. Is there any practical advice that you would give, or, that maybe you experience with the startups that come to Israel and say, like, I didn't know it was going to be like this, or I thought maybe it was going to be like that. I feel like I say this because sometimes when people talk about, and I've been to Tel Aviv a couple of times, it's a wonderful place. But sometimes people talk about it as if we're talking about El Dorado, or, like a city where the streets are paved with gold. It's, like I said, it's a very, very nice place. It very much reminds me of Southern California, actually. But what would you say, what kind of advice would you have for people to say, like, look, if you're going to work with Israeli people or Israeli companies, it's very important to keep this in mind, do that, et cetera. What would you say?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think I'm still figuring that out. But from what I've experienced, they're typically pretty informal. And by that, I mean, again, coming from Washington, I'm used to wearing suits and everyone's in ties. And here in Israel, you should expect that informality, and it's not a bad thing. That's just the way the country is. You're never going to see, very rarely, you'll see a man with a tie. Usually it's jeans, black t-shirt, very Silicon Valley, but that's just the nature of the country. They could be wearing flip-flops to their meeting, right? And it's not a reflection on you and how they take the meeting seriously or not seriously. That's just who they are. And that was something that was a little bit foreign for me. And Also with the informality of our business, our world lives on WhatsApp. I don't know what it's like in the Basque,
Oh
but like
yeah.
I have
Very.
literally closed partnership deals on WhatsApp. I'm sure that startups have done the same, or very serious interactions, high level, will happen on your phone and not over email or over, and so that, again, that informality makes it you're accessible, and you can just connect with people a lot easier. That was surprising for me. Yeah, I think that, another thing to know is that they're just really eager people. They want to run really, really quickly. And they have a lot of excitement. And you just have to know how to manage that, right? Because like, they're going to be thinking like 20 steps ahead of you. Like they know where they want to go. Because like we said at the beginning, like they're so global minded oriented, and so they have their direction in mind, and sometimes you just have to know how to like manage, set expectations, pump the brakes a little bit. But I think it shows the eagerness, right? There's a drive, a really, really big drive here that Israelis they have broad approach to solving problems. And sometimes it can be like, oh my God, you're running at full speed. And you know what? That's what makes this country so successful at the end of the day.
And once again, going back to this sort of pioneer spirit, or the thought that like, if I don't do it, nobody else will. So like, if this is going to be built, I'm putting the first bricks. And I think that says a lot about, taking the initiative and not waiting for somebody else to take the lead. And I think that is something that would probably set Israel apart. Also, when we talk about the United States, older country in a political sense, but also that pioneer mentality of like, let's build, we're going to do this, and the sort of can-do attitude, which is something I only really learned once I left the United States. So like, yeah, Americans and their can-do attitude. I was like, oh,
right, like,
that is right. That is right.
Yeah.
That's how I do things.
Israelis will literally like, they'll come back with like 10 different ways of doing something. You know what I'm saying? It's like they really think a broad mindset to solving problems. And so I think that's it's super cool. Like they're just creative thinkers. They want to solve problems and they don't want anything to stop them. So they're going to move forward. I mean,
I think that's great too, because it's showing the diversity of thought, but then also knowing full well that that if I come up with 9 solutions, 7 or 8 of them are probably going to fail, and maybe all 9, but that's just a built-in part of the process. I would say it's something that does set apart the Basque Country, or maybe Southern Europe more in general, is the fear of failure, as that, failure is just crushing in terms of social stigma, and that if you fail once, you failed for life. You could also say that, bankruptcy laws and things like that certainly aren't as flexible as they are in the US, but I would say socially speaking, it's what's more embarrassing. And also just particularly because people people didn't grow up with somebody that started their own company, or, like there aren't as many examples. So it just seems like, oh, that's something they do in the Silicon Valley, or only people that are really, really rich. But that's something that I think that in the Basque Country, we definitely need to improve, is to make people understand that, it's not such a big deal. You're not going to find any successful entrepreneur who's never failed. If when they say they have, they're lying.
Yeah. No, I think, Bart, that is actually such a critical point, and it took us too long to get there, because that is part of the culture in this country, where failure is actually celebrated, right? There are ventures, VCs, that will look at a startup founder and really point blank ask you, so where have you failed? Like, why don't I see a failed company that was around for a year on your resume? They want to see experience, and experience come with failures. Actually, something, you mentioned like Europe and the US, like in China, like if imagine trying to start a company after failing your first one, like it is not tolerated, right? It is looked down upon, especially at least from what I know from folks in China. And so in Israel, it is really the opposite. Failing is encouraged. It's part of the process. It's how you get up from those failures that I think makes you a successful founder. And that's something that was also not intrinsic in my DNA. And you know what? We're all human. We have to learn from the failures and do better and take the company to the next level. So it's a very, very different mindset.
I think it's a great point, because I think that it's but I think it also, you know, it even starts when you're a child, you know, when you're in school, to say, you know, this is just part of the process. Like, it's not going to work every time. What's important is trying. And then, like you said, when you fall down, all right, well, how do I get back up? How can I apply those learnings to the next time I do this to make sure I avoid these kinds of problems? This is very, very good. Well, we're almost getting towards the end. I feel like our audience has been too shy to ask questions, but no, it went by super quickly. But what I want to say is this: what do you think, you know, in terms of how you see the evolution of MassChallenge Israel? What are the next steps that you would like to see happen, and how do you see your role in making those steps occur?
Yeah, I mean, my vision is to build out. I would love to triple in the next 3 years the amount of international collaborations that I'm bringing into MassChallenge Israel. I think that is where the most, personally, you know, one of the most exciting avenues of our work is bringing in multinationals that don't have boots on the ground here, countries, governments, corporates that want to connect, and using MassChallenge as that launching pad to connect to early stage founders and the entire ecosystem. I would love to see more programs where we have inclusive entrepreneurship. We're building more regional programs in the north of Israel that will include more Arab Israelis, and also in the West Bank. So we're working to make sure that our tech is inclusive and it represents all citizens of this country. And so that's really my job for the next couple of years ahead, is to make sure that we're scaling and we are growing, and we're not just staying, you know, the same, because a startup wouldn't do that, nor should MassChallenge.
That's really, really great that you have embedded that sort of spirit. And also, as you mentioned as well, the focus on diversity and inclusion is something, an ingredient that I think is all too often forgotten. And also probably another misunderstanding as well too about Israel is perhaps misunderstanding how much diversity there is inside Israel, of all the different backgrounds. Of just earlier this week, I was talking to 2 Argentinian guys who've been living in Israel for the last 30 years. You have people from Ethiopia. You have people from all over Europe, United States, etc. So I think it's in a very, very small place. It's very heterogeneous. You get a lot of different variety, which once again is what creates this sort of richness in terms of dealing with approaching problems and thinking of solutions. Well, it sounds like you have a very good goal, and it sounds like, based on everything you've been doing, that you're well on track to get it. So we'll definitely want to be hearing more about this. I think this will be the first of more than a couple of meetings we'll be needing to have. There's a lot of stuff that we didn't necessarily get to in terms of sector-based things, the kind of startups that you've seen, stuff like that. So I definitely like to know more about that in the future, and also as well to be able to introduce you to some Basque startups. Because, like you said, it's a lot of it's really just exciting to see how different people approach these problems, how they think about solving them, and how we can all kind of learn from each other. So yeah, definitely we gotta mix that up.
I would love that. I'm actually gonna put a link right now in the chat for, if anyone wants to apply to the MassChallenge program in Israel. Applications are open. There's a credit code that I just put there that makes it 100% free to apply. So make sure you jot that down. As I said at the beginning, networking is important. If you're interested to learn more about the program, you can always reach out to me on LinkedIn or through Bart. I'm happy for you to make any connections. I'm happy to talk about it. And I would love to find a way to partner more strategically with the Basque. I know that there are some partnerships with counterparts of mine in Israel with the Basque. And so hopefully we can do something together soon.
Definitely, no doubt about it. We've got the link, so we'll definitely be putting that on LinkedIn, on Twitter, etc. in the next couple of days. We'll be uploading the video as well, and some of the choice moments too. Emily, thank you very much for your time. I look forward to our next conversation, which we will definitely not be allowed to wait 10 years to have.
All right, this was so much fun. Yeah, we should not wait 10 years.
Definitely not. I want to see you long before I turn 45. Absolutely. And hopefully in the same place.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me, and thanks for everyone on the call for bearing with me and joining me tonight.
Thanks so much. Take care. Have a good one. Bye-bye.